Separation and migration of the Cheyenne. Any culture that retains its history and memories by telling and retelling stories and passing them down from one generation to the next is called oral history. This is an educational program covering the separation and migration of the Cheyenne, the 10 tribal bands, the final separation of the Northern Cheyenne and Southern Cheyennes as a result of treaties and acts that have affected the Northern Cheyenne and the coming home of Chief Dullknife and Chief Little Wolf. Today we will be listening to 4 respected Cheyenne tribal members who were interviewed for their knowledge and expertise about the history and culture of the Cheyenne people. Adeline Fox, also known as Buffalo Appearing Woman, is an enrolled member of the Northern Cheyenne tribe. Ms. Fox is a teacher of Northern Cheyenne language and culture. Dr. Henrietta Mann, also known as the woman who comes to offer prayer, is an enrolled member of the Southern Cheyenne tribe. Dr. Mann holds a PhD in Native American Studies. Rubie Sooktis, also known as Flying Woman, is an enrolled member of the Northern Cheyenne tribe. She is an Elkhorn Scrapers Society sister. Lucille Spear, also known as Twin Woman, is an enrolled member of the Northern Cheyenne tribe. Lucille is a Northern Cheyenne elder. Once the Tsistsistas and Suhtaio emerged as one tribe, they became one of the nomad tribes of the Great Northern Plains. When they became one tribe, they became known as the Cheyenne people, a name given to them by the Sioux.
The Cheyenne, who had been visited by sweet medicine, brought our sacred arrows, and the Suhtaio, who had been taught by erectorns, brought the sun dance, the great medicine dance, and the sacred buffalo hat that kept us strong as a people.
The people's life in the plains had its hardships and difficulties. Wildlife disappeared from their hunting grounds. Nature failed to provide wild vegetation, and battles with tribal enemies continued. But in spite of their hardships, the Cheyenne people were a highly organized tribe. They existed under a tribal structure that provided the people with governmental, military, social, and spiritual units. The one key responsibility of the people within the tribal structure was the survival of the entire tribe. A critical aspect of the tribe's survival was the tribal bands. As both the oral and written history indicates, the Cheyenne people existed within 10 tribal bands. To the Cheyenne people, the tribal bands represented a guarantee for survival, at least against a total annihilation of the entire tribe by a tribal enemy or later by the U.S. military. So even if 9 bands were annihilated, there would be one group of Cheyennes that would survive and carry on the tribe and its ways and its traditions and its beliefs. The other reason is for economic reasons. Some say that there was maybe 200 per band or 300 per band, or maybe less. They were made up of different Cheyenne families. For social reasons, like intermarriages within families was prevented. It was easier to feed 200 people and to handle 200 people. So for a lot of reasons, the tribe had the 10 bands. A band consisted of families. During most of the year, the bands lived by themselves. They came together in the summer for the major Cheyenne ceremonies and tribal hunts. Each band had a particular location in the large tribal camp circle. The eventual and permanent separation of the Cheyenne into the Northern Cheyenne and Southern Cheyenne was a result of treaties and acts. The Northern Cheyenne and the Southern Cheyenne tribes consisted of both Tsistsistas and Suhtaio. Many treaties, such as the 1825 Friendship Treaty, the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, also known as the Great Treaty at Horse Creek, the 1861 Fort Wise Treaty, The 1865 Treaty of the Little Arkansas and the 1868 Fort Laramie Peace Treaty were made with the Cheyenne as well as other tribes. Treaties were made to instill peace among the Cheyenne, the military, and the white settlers. The 1825 Friendship Treaty was negotiated to allow safe passage across Indian Territory and to establish trade relationships with the white settlers.
The 1825 Treaty of Friendship was undertaken and negotiated between 4 Cheyenne chiefs and 9 warriors who probably represented one band of Cheyennes and the United States federal government. The Cheyennes went to visit General Henry Atkinson on the Missouri River, and they negotiated this treaty. And at that time, we Cheyennes were living around and near the Black Hills. The Cheyennes acknowledged the sovereignty or the supremacy of the United States federal government and agreed to certain trade relationships with the non-natives that we were to welcome or greet as the concept of manifest destiny was carried out in terms of settling this land from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This was after the Louisiana Purchase, the expedition of Lewis and Clark, and we knew in terms of the prophecies that both Sweet Medicine and Erectorns had told us we would someday meet these strangers who would come across our hunting territories. This meeting with General Atkinson was very historic in the respect that this meeting resulted in the first treaty that we as Cheyennes ever made with the United States federal government. Unfortunately, we didn't know what it would mean for us in the future, and that acknowledging the United States government would have a higher status than our traditional government, the Council of 44 Peace Chiefs. So that certainly set into motion a whole different concept of government. This friendship treaty really was slanted and biased in favor of the United States federal government, and we pledged ourselves to peace and friendship with the United States. The federal government wanted to engage in peaceful relationships so that they wouldn't have to worry about their people who were cutting across and coming into Cheyenne homelands, hunting territories. It was really actually much more economical to negotiate treaties than it would have been to engage in military conflict.
The treaty was signed in Fort Laramie, Wyoming, due to regulation of trade to remain within the limits of their particular districts of their lands. They agreed to give safe conduct to all legal persons who may be legally authorized by the United States government.
The 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty was accepted by all Cheyenne and is commonly referred to as the Great Treaty at Horse Creek. The significance of this treaty was to establish peace among the Cheyenne and other tribes and the white settlers crossing Indian Territory.
This treaty was signed in September of 1851, and there were some 10,000 Indians that attended that particular treaty negotiation at Fort Laramie. There were so many people there that the treaty negotiations were moved to Horse Creek, which is near Fort Laramie. And as Cheyennes, we more commonly refer to the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie as the Great Treaty at Horse Creek. The significant aspect of the Fort Laramie Treaty, or the Great Treaty at Horse Creek, is the fact that it was accepted by all Cheyennes. And it was also blessed by the Cheyennes having a sacred arrow ceremony to bless this peace that they felt had been instituted and established through this particular treaty. This was a treaty of peace and friendship, and in that treaty we accepted any responsibility for any kind of military conflict or adverse actions that were committed against the immigrants coming across that land. The Horse Creek Treaty was to provide us with annuities for 50 years. However, once it reached the United States Senate, that body of the United States Congress that is responsible for ratifying treaties, that 50-year period was shortened to 10 years for annuities. And so this is something apparently that tribal leadership later accepted. I think also that is important about this treaty is that by allowing roads to be built through our prime hunting territory and in our homelands, some of those immigrants came carrying many diseases with them for which we had no natural immunity. So that certainly had a great impact upon us as a people and decimated us in terms of the fact that we didn't have any inoculations. We had not had them before. We had not had the opportunity to build up our immune systems to them.
The 1861 Fort Wise Treaty established a small reservation for the Cheyenne in the present-day Colorado.
The Treaty of Fort Wise was signed in February of 1861, and leadership had been at peace. The Treaty of Fort Wise established a small reservation for Cheyennes in the southeastern corner of Colorado. And what is significant about this treaty is that we gave up all of the land that had been guaranteed to us by the Fort Laramie Treaty in exchange for this small reservation. Black Kettle was one of the Cheyennes that signed it, and this treaty certainly was not accepted by and approved by the Northern Cheyennes and the Southern Cheyenne Dog Soldiers. Black Kettle, who is reputed to be the most peaceable of all Cheyenne peace chiefs, had negotiated that particular treaty.
The 1865 Treaty of the Little Arkansas was negotiated following the Sand Creek Massacre of 1865, involving Chief Black Kettle's band. It was also the hope of all involved for lasting peace.
The Treaty of Little Arkansas was signed in October of 1865. This was after the Sand Creek Massacre. That particular treaty provided for remuneration and lands to be given to the survivors of Sand Creek. It also established a reservation for the Cheyennes that straddled the states of Kansas and Oklahoma as we now know it. So you can see that we're being pushed ever southward. We're now in Indian Territory for those of us in the South. And it seems with each succeeding treaty, our land base was continually eroded. This treaty also, like the Fort Laramie Treaty, provided for the safe passage of immigrants and the right of government to build roads and forts. But it was the wish and the desire of those that signed this particular treaty that there would be a lasting peace, because they had just signed the 1861 treaty, then experienced the massacre at Sand Creek, which, again, there was differing and varying opinions within the tribe. And the sacred arrows were taken north, and Black Kettle, after the massacre at Sand Creek, took his band south into the Indian Territory in an effort to avoid conflict and to be assured of some kind of peace.
The 1868 Fort Laramie Peace Treaty was negotiated to once again establish peace with the white settlers. This was the only treaty signed by the Northern Cheyenne, with Chief Dawknife as one of the signatories. This was the last government document Chief Dawknife ever signed. I have never seen another treaty that was signed by the Northern Cheyennes. The 1868 Fort Laramie Peace Treaty makes a reference to the Northern Cheyenne. And the issue with that treaty is it did not establish a home territory for the Northern Cheyenne. The treaty specifically states that the Northern Cheyenne either attach themselves to the Great Sioux Nation or the Crow tribe or their relatives, the Southern Cheyenne. After the signing of that treaty, it was 1872 or 73, Dawknife and Little Wolf traveled to Washington, D.C. and met with President Ulysses Grant, an attempt to explain to him that because they don't understand English and can't read English, they did not know this treaty did not establish a home for the Northern Cheyennes. President Grant, his response was, well, that's no excuse. you have to attach yourself to either the Great Sioux Nation or the Crow people or the Southern Cheyennes. It was a very difficult treaty because the Northern Cheyennes, they've always been extremely independent, and they have throughout their history fought for their independence. It wasn't so much that they didn't want a reservation, but they wanted their own reservation, their own government, their own everything. In reviewing the signatures on that 1868 treaty, my grandfather, Don Knife, was the last one to sign it. And that was the only document he ever signed with the federal government. So the 1868 Peace Treaty was not a very good treaty for the Northern Cheyennes. But on the other hand, the U.S. government was not aware there was Northern Cheyennes, because all these years he had been working with the Southern Cheyennes. And the 1868 treaty was a recognition for the Northern Cheyenne tribe through the document.
There were a lot of our Cheyenne warriors and Cheyenne chiefs that signed it, and I would like to name them off. It was Little Shield, White Crow, Black Bear, Medicine Man, Little Wolf, Short Hair, Dull Knife, the man that falls from his horse, Sorrow Horse, the Underman, the Man in the Sky, the Big Wolf, and the Bull. And the U.S. commissioners were W.T. Sherman, Lieutenant General William S. Harney, Albert H. Terry, C.C. Auger, John B. Sanborn, S.F. Toppin. These were the commissioners from the United States government. And there were people that attested it. The Cheyennes have two different lifestyles, and that's how some of these treaties have affected us, because it did separate us.
Treaties were signed by the Southern Cheyenne, which helped them establish their permanent home in Oklahoma. Not until 1884 did the Northern Cheyenne receive land from the federal government to establish the Ton River Indian Reservation by way of executive order. The executive order was signed by President Chester A. Arthur. The Southern Cheyennes made a treaty with the federal government in 1825, the Friendship Treaty, and the subsequent treaties began to give land to the Southern Cheyennes. They began to create little reservations until they end up at the Oklahoma Indian Territory through the 1868 treaty, which put them on further west of the Arkansas River. And when the Southern Cheyennes were placed at the Oklahoma Indian Territory, that became their permanent home. The only Northern Cheyenne treaty they ever signed with the United States government was the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. The Southern Cheyenne children were already going to school, and they were already farming before the Northern Cheyennes. That's separation and coming together, the permanent separation, placed the Southern Cheyennes in Oklahoma and Northern Cheyennes in Montana, but they're still one. Culturally, language-wise, and spirituality, they still share those things. And they go back and forth, and there's intermarriages. In September of 1878, Chief Don Knife and Chief Little Wolf and their bands escaped from the Oklahoma Indian Territory. The Dawes Act and Allotment Act came after the establishment of the Ton River Indian Reservation in 1884. The Executive Order of 1884, signed by President Chester A. Arthur, established the Ton River Indian Agency. Don Knife and his band and the Little Wolf Band were removed to the Oklahoma Indian Territory and lived in Oklahoma for a year. There was a great deal of starvation, there was a great deal of sickness, and there was a great deal of death. They escaped the Indian Territory and walked back to their old homelands in the north and were captured in Fort Robinson, Nebraska. And as a result of not wanting to be sent back to Oklahoma, they escaped, and the result of that has been the establishment of the Northern Cheyenne Reservation.
They were sent after the battle at the Bighorn, when the Cheyennes and the Sioux defeated Custer and the soldiers, and they were punished. They were sent to Oklahoma to live. They weren't given a reservation like they wanted. So they had to live there, and because of malaria, smallpox, a lot of disease, no food, they decided to speak to the people that were in charge and ask if they could be sent back to Montana. They were refused their request. So they started out on their way. It was in Kansas somewhere when they could see the soldiers coming. The medicine men took out their pipe and they smoked. They prayed, they asked for help. And then they came upon a small rise, and there was a little meadow, and across there was hills and some trees. And after they prayed, these medicine men told everybody to move this way. And then one of them got up, got his stick, and he marked a line in the ground along the way. He told everybody, now you start moving across. Don't run. Don't hold your children back. Let them play and run. And when you get across there into the hills and trees, you split up and hide. These soldiers came, and the tracks ended right there where they had to make the line. They were going up and down, looking for caves and where they might have hid. But they didn't find nothing. When they looked, they saw a herd of buffalo kind of grazing and moving slowly across that way, and little buffalo calves kind of romping and running. Those were the children. In their eyes, they saw buffalo, but it was the Cheyennes.
Upon arriving in present-day Nebraska, the two bands separated and continued their tracks separately. Chief Little Wolf and his band camped for the winter along the Lost Cherry Creek east of Fort Robinson. Chief Donai wanted to keep going to try and reach Red Cloud's agency. While traveling in a winter night, Chief Donai and his band unexpectedly ran into a military group from Fort Robinson. The two groups negotiated, and Chief Donai and his band surrendered and went to Fort Robinson. Upon arriving at Fort Robinson, the Cheyenne were asked to surrender their weapons. But what the military didn't know was that they had already hid the better weapons underneath their clothing. They were housed in an empty barracks, and for a time were allowed to move about the fort. Chief Donai met with the military leaders, and he was told they would not be allowed to move home in the north. They would have to move back to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. Chief Donai said they could not move back to Oklahoma. He said they would not survive if they went back. During the days that followed, the Cheyenne decided to break out and run for their freedom.
We need to try to break out so we can continue on home. There'll be some of us that won't make it, but we're going to make it. The Cheyennes are going to be, they're going to survive. There's going to be a Cheyenne tribe in the future.
After camping for the winter along the Lost Cherry Creek, Chief Little Wolf and his band set out once more for their home in the north. The military at Fort Keogh in present-day Miles City, Montana, sent out a cavalry group along with the Sioux and Cheyenne scouts to try and intercept Chief Little Wolf and his band. They met around the Powder River, which is around present-day Broadus, Montana. The meeting was friendly, and Chief Lulewolf agreed to bring his band to Fort Keogh. At Fort Keogh, Chief Lulewolf and his band were united with other Cheyenne. Of the 149 Cheyenne captured at Fort Robinson, 61 were killed, and many of the survivors were wounded. Chief Dunlap and his family made it to the Pine Ridge Agency in present-day South Dakota. The survivors of the breakout were taken to the agency as well, and were eventually moved to Fort Keogh to join Chief Lulewolf and the other Cheyenne people. Although many battles were fought and many lives were lost, the Cheyenne made it home. They had earned their right to remain in the North. Due to overpopulation of Fort Keogh and the large division of the Cheyenne, Colonel Miles gave permission for some Cheyennes to leave the fort to hunt and eventually homestead along the Tun River. In time, the Cheyenne that were living in other areas came back to Fort Keogh. The white settlers in the area did not like this and asked for them to be removed. A commissioner from the Indian Bureau came to Montana to investigate any problems with the Cheyenne and the white settlers. The commissioner found the Cheyenne deserved to be where they were, and he would eventually send a special agent to distribute supplies and rations. This put the Cheyenne under the Indian Bureau, which eventually led to the granting of land for the Cheyenne. In 1884, President Chester A. Arthur signed an executive order establishing the Tun River Indian Reservation, known today as the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. The 1887 Dawes Act was not a very good act for the tribes. It allowed for the distribution of land to individual tribal members, who in turn could sell the land to anyone. As a result, the tribes lost a vast amount of their land. The Dawes Act has to do with the Native American lands that were given out as allotments. And the allotments were given to individuals. The Dawes Act, in one sense, gave the Native American individuals land, but at the same time, there was also a provision within the act that stated the allottees could sell the land to anybody. And as a result of that, the Native Americans lost a lot of land. The Northern Cheyennes felt the impact of the loss of their traditional territorial grounds through Western expansion and the treaties and also the Dawes Act. The 1926 Allotment Act provided tribal members of the Northern Cheyenne an allotment of 160 acres of land on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. The 160 acres provided the tribal members an individual land base from which they could farm and become self-sufficient. The Northern Cheyenne were the last of the American Indian tribes to be allotted land under the Allotment Act. To understand the 1926 Allotment Act of the Northern Cheyenne people is to go back to 1884 when the Northern Cheyenne Reservation was established. The 1926 Allotment Act was the very last Allotment Act U.S. Congress passed in 1926. But it must be pointed out the Northern Cheyennes petitioned the government to give them 160 acres or to give them allotments. There are those that say they wanted the allotments because they were always under constant threat of being removed to the Oklahoma Indian Territory even after the reservation was established. So the 1926 Allotment Act was extremely important to the Northern Cheyenne tribe. Today, the Northern Cheyenne tribe consists of 8,500 enrolled tribal members, and the land base consists of 445,000 acres. As time goes by, and as our elders leave us, preservation of tribal history and culture is inevitable. We must continue our traditional way of life and remember our ancestors and their fight for the home we have today. This has been an educational program covering the separation and migration of the Cheyenne. We have covered the separation of Tsistsistas and Suhtaio, the 10 tribal bands, the final separation of the Northern Cheyenne and Southern Cheyenne due to treaties and acts with the government, and the coming home of Chief Donknife and Chief Little Wolf. The American Indian Tribal Histories Project would like to thank Adeline Fox, Dr. Henrietta Mann, Rubie Sooktis, and Lucille Spear for sharing their knowledge of the Northern Cheyenne people.